Hello everybody, and welcome to an audiobook stream. On a Friday night, too. Well, there've got to be some people who are in relaxing on a Friday. I know I'd been promising to start a new audiobook for several weeks, because I hadn't done one this year. I was trying to cut back on streams a little bit. But then work kept me so busy that I was too tired on the days after work, or would just get home too late. But I got home timely tonight and was too tired to go out, so I thought, we may as well start the book tonight. And it's a horror novel, which is perfect to carry us into Spooktober and beyond. And I hope everybody has had a good week, and their weekend is off to a good start. Thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. On Sunday, we tried to make more progress in A Nameless Inheritance. And on Saturday, we played a couple of short cinematic platformers. And on Wednesday, we finished the incomparable Flashback. Is it too soon to play it again? But also, schedule will be a bit strange next week, and I knew I wouldn't have time for a bonus stream then. So, we're getting started now. And the novel is Cold Harbor by Francis Brett Young, published in 1925, which means it's now in public domain, and I can do whatever the hell I want with it. More or less. I don't know, I considered going into copyright law, decided not to go into law at all, but the important thing to know is that Twitch can't, see me reading this and be like, hey, DMCA, and then have me thrown in jail or something. Oh, and thank you, AWOL Trooper. You guys should go check out AWOL Trooper. Yeah, I think reading the Prelude in the first 2 chapters, about 50 pages or something, so I imagine stream will only be an hour tonight. But as a reminder, when I'm reading audiobooks, I put them up on YouTube afterwards, and theoretically someday put them on LibriVox. So I'll have raids disabled, and I won't be responding to chat till the end, and I won't have TTS turned on. Not that you guys would know if I did. Is that... Yes, actually I should disable alerts too, shouldn't I? There. And what is this novel about? Well, I looked it up. I was trying to decide which public domain horror novel to read this year, and must have sounded interesting, or maybe I just found a reasonably priced copy of the book. Is this like it was not a first edition. It's okay, second printing, 1926. What do I know? Do my allergies ever go away? Cold Harbor by Francis Brett Young. Amico suo Axel Munte, medicus scriptori, scriptor medico. Prelude. On the evening of the Wakes' arrival, we all stayed out smoking on the terrace after dinner. We sat there silent, for Ronald Wake and his wife, who was a stranger to me, had hardly recovered from the violence with which they had been whirled out of autumnal London into this blander air, and the fourth member of the party, Harley, the island's new chaplain, lay under the weight of diffidence which constrains a parson in the company of the obviously unorthodox, and a stranger present at the meeting of old friends. I couldn't help liking Harley in spite of his awkwardness. A long-limbed, ruddy, simple-minded fellow who roughed it through the Salonika campaign and been invalided to his thankless charge with a malarial heart. I felt rather sorry for him. It wasn't his fault that his first visit had happened on this particular night. Even at the expense of the older and more familiar guests, I felt it my duty to put him at his ease, if only to persuade him that we literary people weren't quite as extravagant as the old ladies in the pensione had told him, and for this persuasion no evidence could have been stronger than the presence of Ronald and his wife. Ronald particularly. As yet I could not guess what Evelyn was made of, but he, the best and oldest of my student friends, was as near the perfect type of medical devotion, humanity, and level-mindedness as one could imagine. There are very few doctors, even the worst of them, whose souls the practice of medicine has not in some degree ennobled. Its very seriousness imposes a discipline and invites sacrifices which they are often at pains to conceal, being as shy of their virtues as most of us, and having more virtues than most of us to be shy of. And Ronald Wake, more than any man I know, carried his character on his face. It was good to see him again in the first relaxation of this Italian holiday for which he had been waiting ever since the end of the war. No one but a doctor or a doctor's wife can realize exactly what such a holiday meant. I knew it, for I had been a doctor myself. I knew how the early stages of such a freedom must be haunted by the tinkle of a phantasmal night bell. I knew the luxury of waking in a room where such irritations don't exist, and it did me good to see the contentment that gradually settled over his face as he lay back in his chair, a fat Havana between his teeth, and, at his elbow, a glass of the Sindaco's wine in the garnet perfection of its fourth year. We sat, as I have said, most quietly. When old friends meet after many years, there is surprisingly little need for speech. The moon came sailing over Solaro, revealing the mountain's huge and kindly curves, imprisoning the silhouette of a solitary stone pine, etched as with Indian ink. Its light trembled down over the olives in ripples of tarnished silver, waking them as it passed, and gradually the outstretched arm of the land revealed itself, like the paw of a sleeping lion laid upon the somnolent sea. No other light, no other sound. One of those mysterious moments of beauty and of silence in which familiar things and people become doubtful, questionable, and one asks oneself, suddenly, what it is all about. No doubt Mr. Harley could have explained. But I did not ask him. For the present I was happy to dwell on the memories that the vision of Wake, so familiar from the thinning hair on his temples to his supple surgical fingers, renewed. Once our lines had lain in the same groove. We had talked the same language, read the same books, moved to the same enthusiasms, but the war had separated us, and more than the war, the peace. Now all my life was different from his. In our converse, even in our unspoken thoughts, there must be reservations, suppressions of individual experience that delicacy withheld. And now, of course, he was married. There, in the long chair beside him, lay the woman who had absorbed him, the shadowy Evelyn, who had bloomed and faded in his infrequent letters, suddenly made manifest in the flesh. How many times had marriage been the solvent of such friendships as ours? As I gazed at this slim, dark creature, lost in the woolly whiteness of her cloak, I wondered what she really was, and if her heart were as free from grudging as my own. That she was beautiful in a shy, dark, fragile way, I must admit. That she was passionately devoted to Ronald I could guess, for in the darkness her hand had stolen to find his. But their eyes had only met mine once, and that for the merest moment, and it had seemed to me that they were frightened, not necessarily of me, but of some danger, present or barely past, of which Ronald's were wholly innocent. I wondered. Harley cleared his throat. It was lucky, in a way, I reflected, that a fourth person should be present at this encounter. The reflection was ungenerous, but justified by the situation's delicacy. "The evenings," he said, "are growing decidedly more chilly. Last night the thermometer fell to 60. "But that," said Mrs. Wake slowly, "is an English summer temperature. When we left London it was freezing. I feel as if this moonlight actually warmed me. The air's so still here." "Yes," Wake murmured deeply, "and the whole place so intensely peaceful and kindly. There's something odd and settled about it, in spite of your neighbor the volcano. Something clear-cut and stable that makes for healthiness. I should imagine that your islanders aren't over-troubled by their imagination like us northerners." And he glanced tenderly at his wife. "The silence, too," he went on. "There's only one sound I can hear, down in the olives there, like a dove crooning, only hollower and louder. Perhaps the quietness of everything else magnifies the sound. Sometimes it stops for 5 minutes together." "Ah, that's the gufo," I told him. "The gufo?" "A kind of owl that lives in the caves on Solaro and comes down to hunt at night." "Stris bubo," the parson put in dolefully. "We used to hear the brutes in the Struma Valley. They're not such big birds as you'd imagine from their voices." "I think I prefer them to our owls," said Mrs. Wake dreamily. "The brown owls at home are rather eerie, with their little ghostly whimperings and soundless wings. Ronald and I—" "It's 1,000 miles away, my child," said Wake quickly. "Don't think of it." "All primitive people are frightened of owls," said Harley. "The villagers here are scared to death of the gufo, birds of ill omen. If they see one, they think they'll die. But they never do. See one, I mean, of course," he added with a little laugh. "The devil is very much in evidence in this island, Padre," I said. "I expect you realize that." "In a sense, yes," he answered earnestly, "and in another as well. I don't take these things lightly. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many men more competent to judge, one of the great evils of modern thought is the decay of belief in the powers of evil." "Such a belief," I agreed, "is certainly a great asset to all mystical religions. But after all, the powers of evil, I wonder if such a thing as positive evil exists." "To people who do not believe in positive good," he answered quietly, "that is not surprising. Naturally, I do, and the existence of the one surely implies the other." "That's just what we said, isn't it?" Evelyn Wake whispered. Ronald nodded assent as he touched her hand. "For myself," said Harley, "I believe in the devil as I believe in God." He rose from his chair as though such a confession compelled him to depart. "Don't go, Padre," I begged him. He hesitated. Evidently he didn't really want to go. "I merely felt," he said, "that a theological discussion might seem out of place. I don't think it's part of my job, you know, to talk shop whenever I make a call, and people here are rather touchy on serious subjects." "Not at all," I said. "You must have been unfortunate in your experience. I think we're all interested. Mr. Wake, at any rate, was intriguingly mysterious just now. It sounded as if you and Ronald had something very definite in your minds." I rallied her. Ronald laughed quietly. "Well, perhaps we have, old fellow. The longer one lives, the more mysterious life seems. Don't you find that yourself?" Hardly in that way. but I'm a very ordinary person, and so I should have said, are you? He is, Evelyn agreed eagerly, but this wasn't an ordinary experience. Psychical experiences aren't, if that's what you mean. I don't know whether you would call it that, she said. In any case, it was so real that we very nearly didn't come here. I'm glad it wasn't any more real than that. Can't you tell us about it? For a moment they looked at one another in silence. It's a long story, Wake said at last, and awkward to tell. There's a certain lack of coherence in it. Part is mine and part is Evelyn's, and neither of us can tell the others, which means that you'll have to piece the two narratives together. Then there's another difficulty. Up to the present, we don't exactly know the end of it, and the possibilities of the end frighten us. Mrs. Wake shivered. Suppose we go indoors, I suggested. No, no, she answered quietly. You'll think me silly, and yet I feel as if this sweet house might be, how can one put it, contaminated by a story like this. Under the open sky it's different, safer somehow. Don't you feel that, Ronald? I know what you mean, said Wake. Yes, I think you're right. Then we'll stay here, said I. I'll fetch out some rugs. If I'm not intruding, Harley began modestly. Of course you aren't. We'll all be delighted. I should like him to stay, said Mrs. Wake, as we disappeared. So we fetched out our rugs and wrapped them round us as we sat on in the moonlight, in the placid, pure loveliness of that amphitheatre of sea and mountain. We sat there, without a word, while Ronald Wake filled his pipe and the guffaw hooted among the olives beneath us. A match had spat and flared in the red cup of his fingers. The bowl of the lighted pipe glowed, the only real thing in our phantasmal group of four. Then, with the sound of Wake's voice, we returned to the plane of ordinary life. Chapter 1. The Fox. It was only a fortnight ago, he began. Looking backward, I find that difficult to believe. We seem to have lived a lifetime since it happened, but, after all, we crammed a good deal of experience into that 24 hours. And then the journey through France and Italy. A change of that kind makes a big break when you aren't used to it. He paused. You'll have to forgive me if I take some time to get going, he went on. I don't want to miss anything. One of the first things we said to one another when it was over was, "There's a story for our novelist." Possibly you won't agree. You novelists are very capricious about your material. It wouldn't be the first yarn of mine that you've politely turned down. But that can't be helped. We still feel the weight of it, both of us, and in any case, I've got to get it off my chest. Confession is good for the soul, eh, Padre? Harley nodded half-heartedly. The question of auricular confession, he began, and then subsided. A fortnight ago, Wake continued. Of course, this trip had been settled by then, so Eve and I decided to snatch a short weekend in the Marches. Clune, Radnor Forest, the Stiper Stones, and that sort of thing. The grayling were just coming on nicely in the Thames with the fall of the leaf, and I'd had no fishing all summer. So we bundled a few things together and set off in the old Darracq. A splendid time we had, the car running like an angel, and the country showing up for all it was worth. A regular Indian summer, all skies, positively flagrant colour on the woods, and all the dear places looking their very best and most wistful. After 2 days of it, we felt years younger. I'll say no more of that. You can picture it for yourself much better than I can tell you. Very well. On the 3rd day we left Pen-y-Bont, and knew that it was all over, not only our trip, but the celestial weather. All the way up the long Mynd it threatened, and when we crossed the bridge at Shrewsbury and got on to Watling Street, we knew we were in for it. These new tarmac roads have an extraordinarily sullen look in stormy weather. They don't blend with the landscape like the roads we used to walk on. Every main road in England nowadays is just like another, and motoring ceased to be a pleasure with a fool on his wrong side round every corner. But that didn't matter to us, as it happened. We knew what we were in for, and only wanted to make speed in front of the dirty weather that was coming up out of the west. We just went plugging on all out, and all the time the Welsh hills behind us grew clearer and blacker, just as if they were racing after us. At Wroxeter, by the wall of Uriconium, the wind gave us a great hit on the back, and the rain came so thick that we couldn't even see the Wrekin in front of us, so we resigned ourselves and made what speed we could. Wet macadam, ragged hedgerows, blurred empty villages, the tires hissing and skidding over potholes, and the engine full of strange noises as if it knew we were being overdriven and hated it. The Severn at Innsbridge was like a dirty ditch. We crossed it. We'd planned to put in that last night at the Far Forest, or Mamble, one of those villages near Clowes Top, but when we saw the rain dripping off black thatches, the idea of a strange cottage somehow lost its appeal. The only thing that could put us right was a bath in a civilized hotel, so we went through Bewdley by the main road to North Bromwich, thinking of you in Italy, you lucky devil. By this time, of course, it was getting late. Then the poor old car struck. First a puncture. We tried to persuade ourselves it was only a Worcestershire road, but that regular bump wouldn't be denied, so I had to crawl out and change a wheel that covered me with red Radnor mud. E was behaving like a saint. The change took me 10 minutes, but we hadn't gone another mile before the engine started misfiring so badly that I had to grind up every rise on low gear, and even then couldn't be sure that she'd reach the top. So I crawled out into the road again and swore and stared at the steaming bonnet. First I took out the plugs one by one. Of course they were all right. Then I cleaned up the magneto distributor. Nothing much wrong there either. Then I took down the petrol filters and cleared out a fair amount of the alluvium that they sell you in these road pumps, but not enough to account for all the trouble. And last of all, I ran the mischief to earth in the float chamber of the carburetor. Water, of course. That cost us half an hour, and it was growing dark earlier than usual with that black sky. Off we went again, the engine willing as a horse when you've taken a stone out of its frog. And we regretted all the names we'd called it. 3 miles of good going, and then bump, bump, bump again. Another puncture, and only one spare wheel. By this time we were too far gone to curse. We felt more like crying. You see, we were still 10 miles or more from that civilized bathroom. Every jolt of the wheel was making waste rubber of a new cover and tube, and the rain was still coming down in bucketfuls. We huddled up in a blank of consternation as we climbed the brow of the hill on which the puncture had caught us. To the right lay a big expanse of parkland, whose name you probably know, and over beyond it 2 conical hills, each with smooth slopes and a fleece of firs on top. To the left we could see nothing for trees until we reached the summit and pulled up at a crossroad by a squat turnpike house. And as we stood there, a curious thing happened. A kind of window opened in the rain, just as if the cloud had been hitched aside like a curtain, and in the space between we saw a landscape that took our breath away. The high ground along which the road ran fell away through a black woody belt, and beyond it, for more miles than you can imagine, lay the whole basin of the Black Country, clear, amazingly clear, with innumerable smokestacks rising out of it, like the merchant shipping of the world laid up in an estuary at low tide, each chimney flying a great pennant of smoke that blew away eastward on the wind, and the whole scene bleared by the light of a sulphurous sunset. No need ever tell me again that the Black Country isn't beautiful. In all Shropshire and Radnor we'd seen nothing to touch it for vastness and savagery. And then this apocalyptic light. It was like a landscape of the end of the world, and, curiously enough, though men had built the chimneys and fired the furnaces that bred the smoke, you felt that the magnificence of the scene owed nothing to them. Its beauty was singularly inhuman, and its terror, for it was terrible, you know, elemental. It made me wonder why you people who were born and bred there ever write about anything else. For the moment it knocked us so much that we forgot about our puncture. We sat staring at it without a word to say for ourselves, and then, suddenly, Eve nudged my arm and pointed to the signpost at the crossroads. "To Fox Inn and Cold Harbour," it said. It didn't tell us how far off the Fox Inn or Cold Harbour might be, but an inn was an inn, however cold its harbourage might be, and frankly, we'd had enough of it. "Well, shall we give it a trial?" I said, and Eve, like the sportsman she is, said yes. So far, we'd generally been pretty lucky in our choice of English inns, and any port in a storm. So we turned quietly out of the main road and down the lane, a reddish sandstone lane that seemed unusually human after so many miles of blue macadam. At first the surface felt reasonably decent, but after 50 yards or so of straight running, the road changed its mind and made a series of turns on itself, as though it had taken fright, degenerating at the same time into a green drive, with turfy ruts on either side, and overhead a roof of hazels that made a tunnel of it. At first we thought we must have been mistaken, and missed another branch at the first turn. The drive looked as if it must end in a farmyard. But, in any case, it was quite impossible to turn, for the brambles and hazels swept the wings of the car as we were lumbering down, and when we'd passed a muddy water-splash, the lane recovered its dignity, pulling us up a sharp, stormy rise into the open, with a deep green fosse on either side of it. We hadn't been exploring Uriconium and Caerwent for nothing. If a road were Roman, this one was. And a confirmation suddenly jumped to my mind. I remembered reading somewhere that all the cold harbours in England, and there are lots of them, are associated with Roman remains. Cold Harbour, the books say, is a corruption of Colonia Arborum. It sounds as far-fetched as many archaeological etymologies, but there, in this case, were the raised road and the double ditch to prove it. And we were just debating how the road had ever got there, when all of a sudden we ran up another rise and slap in the face of the Fox Inn itself. Wake turned to me. "I expect you know it." "Yes, I know it quite well," I told him. "I remember being driven there as a child to a meet of the Stourton Hounds, though I don't think I've ever seen it since." "Nothing very unusual about the Fox," he went on. "An ordinary country inn. 2 stories of red brick, half-timbered, beneath a hipped roof on curled tiles. You'd have taken it for a farmhouse rather than an inn, because of the barns and sheds at the back of it, if it hadn't been for the sign over the door. Once, I suppose, the Fox had been there as large as life, but when his colour faded with sun and rain, they decided it would be cheaper to replace his image by his superscription in black paint. Underneath this you could read the name of the licensee, Hannah Higgins, but the Higgins was many years older than the Hannah, and the letters of Hannah were so cramped that one could guess how some years since Mrs. Higgins had lost her man and couldn't afford to have her signboard repainted. Poor soul. From the desolation of the whole place, we couldn't expect more than a melancholy comfort, but in such cases, of course, you never know. And, as it happened, we were quite wrong. When we pulled up in front of the inn door and knocked, it was opened by a buxom woman of anything between 30 and 40, with a sanguine, youthful face and remarkably fine grey eyes. She welcomed us with a smile, and we asked for rooms and shelter for the car. She ran out into the mud, in slippers whose heels were far too high for the job, and pushed open the gate of the farmyard for me to drive in. There were 2 wide doors at the end of the barn, and a huge empty space inside, warm and smelling of old hay. She shooed a score of broody hens out of the darkness to make way for me. "They come in here to roost," she said. "I'd best clear them all out first, or they'll be making a mess of the car." She came back, flushed, almost pretty, with a bundle of musty sacks spread over the radiator, running on with her chatter all the time, as though it were a relief for her to open her mouth. Sometimes she'd give her hair an embarrassed poke. I suppose she wasn't sure that she was looking her best. I thanked her for the sacking. "You seem used to this sort of thing," I said. "I shouldn't have thought that you'd get many people here right off the main road." She laughed. "No, that we don't," she said. "Not as many as I'd like myself. Mother's getting up in years, and it makes no odds to her. It's not the trade one misses so much as the company. But then, we can't complain. They might easily have taken the license away, and we do have people, on and off, who take a fancy to stay the night. Some come to look at the old Roman road, and they used to come to visit Mr. Furnival at Cold Harbour." Wake paused and looked at me. "Mr. Furnival at Cold Harbour," he repeated. "Does that mean anything to you?" "It means a deuce of a lot," I said, "if your Mr. Furnival is mine. But I didn't know he lived at Cold Harbour, and in any case, I'm not going to interrupt you. Let's get on with Miss Higgins, if that's what she was." "Very well, I'll continue. The road ends at Cold Harbour," she said, "so consequently there's no through traffic, as you might call it. Well, that's all right. So now, if you'll excuse me, I'll just pop in and tell Mother and get your room ready. You'd like a fire in it, wouldn't you? And a drop of hot water? Really, you must be perished, ma'am." So off she went. The rain had stopped, and that curious yellow light was gone, leaving nothing but a white mist hanging in the hedges. We tramped in, carrying our sodden overcoats, and heard, as we passed through the hall, the voice of Alma, that was her name, by the way, discussing us in rapid whispers with an older woman. She was far too deeply engrossed to hear us coming, so we pushed through the door on the left, into a long room with one low window looking out onto the green in front, and smiled at each other with the curious restraint that comes over one in entering a strange house. By this time it was too dark to see what the room was like, but it smelt warm and inhabited. It held subdued lights of polished wood and glass and copper, and when Alma came in, a moment later, carrying a lighted lamp, we felt comfortable at once. These things are difficult to describe. I have to fall back on that lame word atmosphere and say that this was friendly. There was hot water in the bedroom, Alma told us. Beautifully clean, too, the whole place, with a ripe smell of autumn. I believe they'd been storing apples on the floor. We came downstairs to an odor of frying bacon. That, and eggs, had been our staple food for the last 3 days, so having got into the habit, we ordered it again. As we entered the room, it positively welcomed us, and we began to thank our stars that we hadn't finished up, as we had hoped, in one of the North Bromwich hotels. There was a bright fire burning, and as we settled down to eat, Alma stood at the foot of the table, just outside our circle of light, as diffident as you can imagine, and yet unmistakably reluctant to leave us as long as there was any chance of gossip. You couldn't blame her. There she was, a fine girl in her way, wasting the best part of her life in a place where she had no chance of any society but that of a handful of farm labourers in the bar, or an odd visitor to Cold Harbour. The last evidently provided her with more entertainment. Whatever we talked about, and we just went on in the lazy discursive way that comes natural at the end of a day in the open air, the conversation always seemed to swing back to that house, and particularly its owner, the Mr. Furnival whose name had cropped up in the very first sentences of our acquaintance. The signpost that had brought us to the Fox, Mr. Furnival had had it put up. The shocking road, Mr. Furnival had defied the county council to touch it. Of course, it was all on his property. The car. Mr. Furnival was fed up with cars. So, for the moment, were we. The admirable beer. Only yesterday Mr. Furnival had remarked that it was in prime condition, and, as Mother said, if it satisfied him, it must be all right. All through our gossip she kept us so firmly anchored to Mr. Furnival that, whenever we drifted away from him, his influence pulled up the conversation with a tug. It became ludicrous, but since Alma was evidently anxious to talk, and to talk on no other subject, we gave her the chance she wanted with the direct question, "Who is this Mr. Furnival?" And that, apparently, embarrassed her. Surely everybody knew Mr. Furnival. He was the owner of Cold Harbour, the big house by the church. There was no village to speak of, just a number of small farms scattered round, and the ruins of the vicarage which had been burnt 10 years ago. Rich? Well, of course he must be a wealthy gentleman to live here. Old? She could hardly say. Certainly he was getting on, but then he wasn't the sort of man whose age you ever thought about. She couldn't even guess how old he was, now she came to think of it. Old enough, at any rate, to have 3 grown-up children, or was it 4? "I suppose he's a widower?" Eve asked quietly. The girl threw back her head and laughed. "A widower? Mr. Furnival? What an idea!" But Mrs. Furnival, it seemed, was an invalid, and always had been since she could remember. By all accounts, what the servants said, she was a very nice lady, quiet, you know, and considerate, never made a fuss about anything. "But to tell you the honest truth," she said, "I've never spoken to her, nor even set eyes on her since I was a child, except through the garden hedge. You see," she explained in a lowered voice, "she doesn't even go out to church. Funny, isn't it? Particularly with Mr. Furnival being such a religious man. But I think something went wrong there. The fact is, she turned Roman Catholic. I'm sure that was a great grief to Mr. Furnival, poor man. I don't think she likes the house either, from what he let slip, and I must say I don't blame her. But of course, he's mad on it." That, I suggested, was natural enough. I suppose it had been in his family for generations. She shook her head. From what her mother had told her, it seemed that Cold Harbour had been a dower house of the Pomfrets, the family that once owned Maughan Hall, where Mr. Willis, the ironmaster, now lived. The Pomfrets, in a manner of speaking, had died out, and Mother had told her that before Mr. Furnival came there 15 years ago and spent a fortune on it, Cold Harbour had been empty for years on end. They did say, of course, that the place was haunted, but folks always made up stories of that kind when a place was left empty for long, and Mr. Furnival often made his joke about it. "Still, I shouldn't like to live there myself," she volunteered. "Why not?" I asked. Again she threw back her head and laughed. Her throat was magnificent. She couldn't say why not. There was something extra quiet about it, those crazy bricked-up windows. And then it was built right over against the graveyard. You'd feel that something was always watching you, taking note of what you did. Of course, it was just silly to get fancies like that into your head. Mr. Furnival laughed at her. He said that he'd never seen anything, and he'd lived there long enough. But once you did get a fancy about a place, it wasn't easy to shift it. And so many stories. What sort of stories? I tried to fix her, but she only laughed nervously. Only the story that the place was haunted. She supposed it was those old Romans or Normans or whatever they were. Mr. Furnival was always explaining, but what was the use of improving one's mind if they were going to end their days in a place like the Fox? She let him talk, that's what she did. It was a pity if a man hadn't someone to talk to. The front door scraped open. We heard heavy steps on the flags of the passage, and a drone of rustic speech. Alma turned to listen, and we hastened to suggest that she need not stay with us. "Oh, that's all right," she answered a little scornfully. "It's only 2 of Mosley's men dropped in for their pint. Mother'll tend to them. It isn't as often as that I get a chance of a chat when the winter sets in. We used to have the meets of the foxhounds here. Foxes are something cruel, too. There's one labouring man that had more than 20 fowls savaged last week, poor chap. But Mr. Furnival's had some sort of ructions with the master, and now they don't come here any more. It's a pity, isn't it? It was fine to see the red coats on a winter morning. Mr. Furnival explained to me what it was, and I'm sure he was right, too, but I just forget what happened. I always tell him he's a quarrelsome nature. He doesn't mind. He just turns it off with a laugh. When you come to understand him, you know, it's... She broke off suddenly, or rather, the thread of the sentence that her mind had framed seemed to dwindle, then snap. We both of us looked up quickly. There she was, standing at the foot of the table, lost to the world. If you'll forgive me being medical, I should say it was like the state of suspension you find in a sufferer from petite mal, minor epilepsy, you know. Then, before she had really come to herself again, we saw a flush of colour sweeping over that fine white throat of hers into her cheeks, and her hands suddenly clenched. The door of the passage grated open again. Light steps echoed in the hall. A man breathed heavily and hung up a flapping mackintosh. "What is it? Are you ill?" Eve asked quickly. No, it's nothing," she answered in a whisper. "Will you excuse me, please?" And she went off, so flustered that she forgot to close the door behind her. We stared at each other for a moment. "Poor thing," said Eve. "She's in love with the man." "Afraid of him," I whispered. "Why not both?" she said. "In any case, it's rather dreadful," we agreed. "But why? Why? Why should we be sitting there, whispering guiltily like children in a schoolroom, listening, glancing anxiously at the open door? The sensation of eavesdropping made me ashamed. I rose quietly to shut it. "Don't do that," Eve implored me. "It isn't that I want to listen," she explained. "I feel so sorry, so frightened for her." And so, for that matter, did I. Of course it was ridiculous. I doubt if either of us alone would have felt anything of the sort. But the curious atmosphere of our arrival in this unreal place, I can't define its unreality or explain it except by the light of that apocalyptic sunset, had made us jointly sensitive. It was just as if those two abrupt turnings, at the place where the Roman road lost itself, had switched us into another place, dimension, whatever you like to call it, of existence, in which the support of ordinary earthly reason were denied. It wouldn't do, for a moment, to admit it, to give way to this emotional panic. It was our duty as rational human beings to fight against it. I determined to permit no nonsense with either of us, so I got up again and shut the door firmly in spite of Eve's protests. "There's no reason why we should behave like two children," I said. "There's no need to imagine anything extraordinary about the case. Here is this girl, Alma, a strong, handsome creature of uncertain age, old enough, at least, to have been happily married many years since, tied by the leg to an old woman in this remote house on a road that leads nowhere. Too much beauty and self-respect to yield to the persuasions of Mr. Mosley's farm labourers. No chance of setting eyes on an eligible man, except when some Roman British enthusiast wanders along here to have a look at the road, or the remains, whatever they are, at Cold Harbour. Not a man in the neighbourhood except this Mr. Furnival, a fellow who's quarrelled with everybody, including the local M.F.H. And Furnival, by all accounts, is equally lonely. His wife has been an invalid for years. His children are all grown up. He has no more outlet than the unfortunate Alma, and so, naturally enough, they find some outlet, of a sort, in each other. The poor chap's so bored that he takes the trouble to walk down here on a wet October night. He hangs up his mackintosh in the hall, as if he belongs here, and spends the evening with Alma and the old lady. Perfectly properly, as far as we know. Why, he even tries to improve her education, talking to her about those old Romans or Normans or whatever they were. But what's the use of improving one's mind if they're going to end their days in a place like the Fox? The position's pathetic, if you like, but nothing else, and certainly it's no business of ours. I thought I'd summed up the case pretty reasonably, but Eve wouldn't have it. As a matter of fact, I'm bound to give her credit for an extraordinarily acute instinct in the matter of human relationships, part of the female savage's protective armament, I suppose. All that may be true enough, she said, but I'm positive that we were both of us right in our first impressions. I said she was in love with him, and you said she was frightened of him. She's unhappy and she's frightened, and she thinks about nothing else. That's why she stayed talking to us, like a child that wants a hand to hold in the dark. All the time that she was here, she couldn't utter a sentence without mentioning his name. She's haunted by him, that's the real truth. She knew that he was coming before anyone could hear his step, and as soon as he came in, she lost possession of herself, simply gave up the ghost. You're a fine sort of doctor if you couldn't realize that. Why, I can see her standing there now, with the words drying up in her mouth, and the will fading out of her. I've never seen anything so pitiable in my life. There must be something wrong with the man. There simply must. I don't think I've ever felt so sorry for anyone. It is our absolute duty to stand by her. That's why I wish you hadn't shut the door. She was so intense about it that I had to tease her. How much pity and how much curiosity? Don't I know you? I said. We seemed to be taking the thing so seriously that I felt forced to lighten it in some way. After all, I told her, we had no right to consider ourselves sent by heaven to censor the morality of Miss Alma Higgins, but the thing had so got on her nerves that she couldn't take my joke, which simply means that she was the more sensitive of the two, as she is, bless her. It's not the body of Alma Higgins I'm worrying about, she said. It's her soul. Well, well, if it comes to that, I said, I really do disclaim all responsibility. We can't, she said. We can't. Looking at her now, you couldn't possibly believe her capable of such intensity, her eyes blazing, and one cheek so flushed that I began to wonder if the drenching we'd got had landed her into an attack of pneumonia. Look here, young woman, I said, I'm going to take your temperature. It almost made the poor child cry. Oh, don't be stupid, dearest, she said. I'm as well as ever I was. It's only that. All the same, I couldn't be satisfied till I'd counted her pulse. No doctor should ever be allowed to treat his wife. It was as quiet and regular as my own. Now I hope you're satisfied, she said. I was, in that particular direction, but not in the other. Evelyn isn't in the ordinary way a nervous or fanciful person, but something in the nature of this place, this encounter, this complex of circumstances, had so unsettled her that I was anxious to get her away from their influence. If you were married, you'd appreciate the infinite shades of feeling by which a man knows when his wife isn't herself, and when a conviction of that kind comes suddenly, mysteriously, without any reason of the kind to which he's susceptible. It's an alarming experience. In my business, of course, to deal with the states of health and disease, and this state, whatever else it might be, was certainly unhealthy. Terror, you know, like our most spiritual diseases, is infectious. The obvious treatment in this case was to remove the patient from the infected area. We couldn't, as you'll agree, turn out again and leave the Fox without an explanation, but we could make sure of an early start next morning by getting to work at once on the wretched puncture that had landed us there. Naturally, I wanted to do this undramatically and without frightening her, so I got up casually and invited her to come and keep me company in the barn. Put on your coat, I said, and then you'll be quite cozy. She answered me without a moment's hesitation. I can't, she said. I'm sorry, but I feel I want to stay. I know you're tired, I told her, but I'm sure it'll do you good. I don't want to leave you alone like this. Like what? She said. Haven't I told you there's nothing the matter with me? There's no reason why you shouldn't go alone if you want to. I tried to persuade her, but she was as stubborn as a horse in a burning stable, and I saw the moment coming when she'd become definitely upset. So, at last, I went out alone, with no comfort except the faith I always have in the rightness of her instincts. Even so, I confess that I felt horribly uneasy. Please don't shut the door, she whispered as I went out. Chapter 2. The Visitor. "Leaving me alone," the voice of Mrs. Wake continued. All the way through her husband's recital, we had hardly been aware of her white presence. Even when he repeated her own words, we had been thinking not of her, the living present woman, but of another figure of his creation, sitting in the lamplight of the parlor at the Fox, with clasped hands and one burning cheek. Her sudden entrance into the story came with the effect of an apparition, intensifying rather than breaking the effect with its ghostly confirmation. But when the first shock of it had subsided, we felt that the tale had not suffered in continuity. The vision of the lamplit table and the woman sitting at it returned, and seemed, indeed, to become more actual as she continued in her low, level voice. "It wasn't only," she said, "that I didn't want to go out with Ronald to the car. I actually wished him to go and leave me alone. I had a feeling, stronger and more positive than anything reasonable, that something which mattered most awfully was going to happen or be said. I felt that I had to see it or hear it, and that he, poor dear, was somehow in the way. We have to be shockingly candid about each other in a story of this kind. It's so important to us, saving your presence, that we should stick to the absolute truth, so you won't be shocked, will you, if we seem a little inconsiderate for each other's feelings? It doesn't mean that we don't, but I'm sure you understand. Well, there I was, sitting at the table with the lamp in front of me, looking into the darkness of the passage through the open door, waiting for something, whatever it was, to happen. Quite happy and contented about it, too, and not in the least, as Ronald suggested, frightened. Not in the least. I suppose I sat there for 5 minutes, after which I began to feel that I'd made rather a fool of myself by being so intense and sending him out into that miserable barn alone. I'd almost decided to put on my fur coat and follow him, and confess how silly I'd been, when somebody, I couldn't see who it was, hurried along the passage into the tap room and left the door of the little private bar behind it open, so that I could hear quite clearly everything that was being said. Then curiosity, I suppose it was curiosity, got the better of me, and I sat still and listened. Ronald, with his exaggerated sense of honor, would probably have shut the door. So you see I was right. He would have been in the way. 2 voices were talking together in the private bar. One, I made sure, was Alma's, and the other, I supposed, was Mr. Furnival's. It was his that did most of the talking. In my own funny little way, Ronald would tell you, I'm rather good at voices. I mean that I can guess much better, for my own satisfaction, what a person is like by hearing his voice than by listening to what he says. Some people go by eyes, and some by mouths, but for me the voice is the most important. And this voice of Mr. Furnival's was something of a puzzle. It was rather light, but low in pitch, what you'd call a musical voice. His speech was educated and refined, but somehow the voice itself wasn't. That's a queer paradox, and I'm afraid I can't explain it more definitely. But there was just one thing more. He had the trick of ending each sentence with a shrill cackle of a laugh. You'll say that it was unfair to judge a man's character by what may have been nothing but a nervous habit. But in this laugh there seemed to be something unnatural, strange, uncontrolled. That's the only word for it. Mad. Whatever impression of culture or kindliness his words might give one, each time he came to the end of his sentence that laugh destroyed it. It seemed to explain the mixture of fascination and fear that poor Alma had shown us. And, of course, when once you got over that, it was awfully interesting. At first they seemed to be talking on the subject that was naturally uppermost in Alma's mind, ourselves. That was the point at which Ronald's scruples would have begun to trouble him. Mine didn't trouble me a bit, and Alma, poor innocent, had nothing but good to say of us. At any rate, it was amusing to hear her descriptions of my old clothes. Evidently she was impressed. She had the idea that we must be very high-up people. Then, to my astonishment, they, or rather he, began to talk about books. It seemed that Mr. Furnival was in the habit of lending books to Alma, and even of reading poetry aloud to her. This must have been the improvement of which the poor girl had spoken to us so pathetically. It made me feel sorry for her, and sorry, in spite of his laugh, for Mr. Furnival. It betrayed such a tremendous desolation in the life of this man, full of enthusiasm for good writing, to find him thrusting it into Alma's unresponsive mind. For if he were half as keen as he seemed to be, he must surely have realized that it was a waste of time. Still, there he was, quoting Chaucer to her. Quite incredibly, unless one explained it by imagining that he knew, as well as I did, that she couldn't tell the difference between Chaucer and Ella Wheeler Wilcox, and merely provided a hypnotized listener into whose ears he could let his enthusiasm flow with a sense of companionship, something more responsive than four blank walls. But then, hadn't Alma mentioned an invalid wife? And in any case, the man must have hypnotized himself to be unaware of Alma's lack of receptivity, sensibility, understanding of any kind, unless it were all a cruel and fantastic joke, as the inhuman cackle at the end of his quotations might have suggested. As for the reason, I soon gave it up, but that, of course, didn't make the phenomena less fascinating. It made no difference, either, to the interest of this one-sided conversation. Apart from his cackle, Mr. Furnival was a very good talker. All through the time that I listened to him, he never said a thing that wasn't individual, peculiar to himself, just as if he looked at everything from an angle out of the reach of you, and me, and other ordinary people. He went on with his easy, mocking way, saying the most brilliant things. I don't suppose Alma, poor darling, enjoyed them, not in the way that they were intended, but I did, every word. So much that I quite forgot poor Ronald grunting away in the barn with a spotlight and tire levers. It never struck me then, as we've both realized since, that dear Mr. Furnival was not talking for Alma at all, and that all this brilliant stuff that he was scattering over the pothouse floor was just, how shall I put it, ground bait for me. If that were so, he must have been even cleverer than we gave him credit for his intelligence must have been able to project itself through the length of the passage and guess exactly the kind of bait that I was likely to be taking. Ronald and I have talked it over many times since, but between us we've never been able to decide by what stroke of divination, after all these exciting feelers, he managed to hit on my own pet, particular, fatal literary weakness, Martok. George Martok, as Ronald will tell you, is my King Charles's head, my private literary infatuation. His poems seldom get into anthologies, and the 2 volumes have never been reprinted since he died about 40 years ago. I suppose you know the usual things about him. He was a schoolmaster in one of the villages on the top of Mendip, in Somerset, an awfully lonely life among curious people. My father was his doctor, so I know his history. He began by writing poems in dialect, rather like Barnes. Then, during the years before he died of pneumonia, his whole style changed. The last third of the 2nd volume is full of things that make me want to howl like a child, because they express all the nostalgia that we Mendip folk feel when we're anywhere else in the world. Lots of people can't see anything in them. Ronald himself is an awful heretic. I dare say they aren't really as good as I imagine, but for me they express everything I've ever felt about that precious country. There's one poem in particular, just a landscape of an October morning, mist, dewy gossamer, black crows rising all together from an empty field, that always stabs me to the heart, and that, the very choicest of my favourites, was what the voice of Mr. Furnival, without the least warning, began to recite. When I heard the first line of it, something possessed me. I can't tell you even now what it was. I got up from the table, my heart jumping out of my body, and went on tiptoe down the passage till I reached the door of the private bar. I stood there, breathless with excitement, until he finished. The door was half closed. I couldn't see Mr. Furnival himself, only the fire burning with a gentle crackle, and Alma sitting opposite him in a rocking-chair with her eyes wide open, fixed on him, and the firelight playing on her white throat. She looked so placid, so subdued, so awfully insensitive, that I didn't know whether to be sorry for her or angry. When he'd finished, she stayed in exactly the same position, fixed, lifeless, just as she had stood at the end of our table. Then came a second of silence, and then the sound of Mr. Furnival's cackle, that was just as if some devil had slashed the canvas of that exquisite picture with a knife. "Well, Alma," he said, "what do you think of this? Of the poem, of course, you'd imagine, but somehow, although I still couldn't see him, I felt that his words had a double meaning, that his eyes were turned to the door behind which I stood hidden, that the sentence was really addressed, not to Alma, but to me, and that his that referred not to the lines which he had just finished reciting, but to the triumphant ease with which he had decoyed me out of my room and along the passage. I felt so certain that he knew I was there that I was ashamed to conceal myself any longer. I had acted with the impetuosity of a schoolgirl, and supposed I must make the best of it. I felt that he was now waiting for me to enter, so in I came. Alma, suddenly aware of my presence, jumped up from the rocking-chair with a start. "Oh!" she cried. "Oh, ma'am, you did give me a start!" She seemed shocked and at the same time relieved, as though my coming had broken some spell and set her free. "I am a one," she said. "Of course, you're waiting for me to clear the table. I'd clean forgot it." She smoothed down her apron and hurried out with hot cheeks. Mr. Furnival and I faced one another. Of course, you'll expect me to tell you what he was like, but I shall leave that to Ronald, not only because he'll be more anatomically exact, but because, at the end of this meeting, I simply couldn't have told you. That sounds ridiculous, but I assure you it's literally true. During all the next half-hour through which I stayed and talked with him, I can honestly say that I had nothing but the mistiest idea of his appearance. Of course, there was no light except that of the fire, but to me he was just a voice and a personality. No, there I'm wrong. 2 voices, 2 personalities. The voice that had evoked all the wistful loveliness of Martok's poem, and the mad, devilish cackle that had destroyed it. It was with the first voice that he spoke to me. "Good evening," he said. "Won't you sit down?" He pointed at the rocking-chair that Alma had just left. I couldn't. Not there. It would have been like delivering myself over to the insinuating comfort of those plushy horrors in a dentist's surgery. No sooner are you in them than he tilts you backwards with a ratchet, and there you are at his mercy. No, thank you. I sat down, as frightened as a mouse, on a stiff-backed chair just beside the door, where the firelight mercifully didn't reach me. "Excuse me," I said by way of explanation, though he, I'm sure, didn't need one. "I thought I heard you reciting one of George Martok's poems." "October? Yes," he said. "That's very clever of you. Very few people have heard of them. Educated people, I mean." "That's just what I thought," I said, "and that's why I asked you." "Do you know viaticum?" he asked quietly. Really, this part of his voice was very beautiful. "Yes, I do," I said, "but don't you think that's rather too terrible?" "Viaticum," he repeated quietly. "Terrible. Ah." And then he went off into that dreadful laugh that was made, I can't express it, for the destruction of beauty, and seemed to exult in it. Oh, how I hated him. "That poem," he went on soberly, "was written in the early part of his last illness, just 4 days before he died. Poor chap, he went up in a flare like a spent candle." "I know," I said. "My father lived at Axcombe, and attended him till the end. You speak as if you'd known him. Did you?" "Didn't I?" he answered. "What's more, my dear lady, I paid for the publication of his second volume. But you aren't a Mendip man, I said. Your name— My name? He laughed. So Alma's been chattering? No, you're quite right. I happened to meet George Martok by accident in the course of my business. He didn't specify what the business was, and indeed it was difficult to guess what it might have been, unless it were that of a school inspector, which isn't the kind of calling one associates with a country gentleman. Matthew Arnold? Still, it was no affair of mine. As a matter of fact, I had already shown myself a little too interested by admitting that I knew his name, so I decided to say no more. There was no need for more, as it happened, for when once he'd got over his little flare-up, he began talking about Martok of his own accord. I sat in the dark and listened. To me it was all very thrilling, for my father, who was just a plain-sailing general practitioner, had only regarded Martok as a club patient, and by the time that I began to be interested in him, had very nearly forgotten all about him. Mr. Furnival was a beautiful talker. He really was. I can't be too emphatic on that point. A conscious artist, if ever there was one, full of understanding and love for his subject. Sometimes, as he spoke, he affected a kind of slangy brutality, as if he were trying deliberately to disfigure the beauty of his theme, and sometimes that awful laugh of his would rip the whole of his picture to shreds. But in spite of all this, I sat there enthralled, transported by what he said. He made George Martok live with something like the poignancy of his own poems. Tears came to my eyes. I couldn't stop them, and the worst of it was that I felt he knew how deeply he had affected me. Of course he knew. When he had come to an end, he proved it by asking if I could stand any more. I had to pull myself together before I answered, pretending that I'd taken it all in cold blood. I did so with a great effort, of which I'm still proud. "Please, go on," I said. "There's nothing that you can tell me about George Martok that won't interest me. The people who admire him are a very small band, but we're very faithful. And, of course, with you the interest's quite extraordinary. You must have been practically the only person who understood him. He'd been dead 10 years when I picked up the first volume in my father's surgery, and by that time he was almost forgotten. There's an actuality about meeting you that I haven't felt before." He chuckled. "I can give you something more than that," he said, "if you'll come over and see me at Cold Harbour. It's only 10 minutes' walk from here. I have the manuscript of the second volume complete, and any number of his notebooks in which he used to scribble his first ideas. How does that appeal to you?" "It's very kind of you to give me the chance," I said. "I must speak to my husband about it." "Naturally," he said, with a mocking inclination of his head. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me in knowing my name." "Ours is Wake," I told him. "My husband is a surgeon. We came here quite by chance on our way from Shropshire to London. Our time, unfortunately, isn't our own. Tomorrow we have to be back in town." "Yes, that's unfortunate," he nodded. "I myself am not an idle man, and it just happens that all tomorrow morning I shall be engaged. But in the afternoon—" That, I told him, would almost certainly be too late. "Even to see George Martok's manuscripts?" he scoffed. "Well, that's a pity. I guess that your husband isn't equally enthusiastic." He put a shade of scorn into the sentence that made me angry. What right had a stranger to pass reflections on Ronald? But before I'd time to express my indignation, he knew that he had ruffled me, and threw in a little sop of flattery. "Of course I know his name," he said. "His genius expresses itself in other directions. But quite apart from Martok, it would be a pity to miss Cold Harbour. The shell of the house is relatively modern, but the interior is full of good things, quite a lot of it pre-Reformation. It was the site, you know, of a Roman villa, the only one for miles. The road that you came in on is Roman, and during recent excavations we found a number of things that are unique, including a pavement that hasn't yet been described. Though I say it, it'll be 1,000 pities if you miss the opportunity, for your own sakes as well as for mine. Then there's another inducement. The house is said to be haunted. Does that attract you?" Evelyn Wake paused for a moment. "Now comes a curious thing," she said. "During all the time that he'd been talking of Martock's life and death, and after that, of the pride that he took in Cold Harbour, I'd felt entirely at ease with him. I'd experienced nothing, I mean, of the indefinitely frightening atmosphere that he brought into the house with him. He had seemed just an ordinary, cultured, sensitive person, talking quite naturally of his enthusiasms. I suppose I had yielded myself unconsciously to the extraordinary beauty of his voice, and my own greedy interest in what he was saying. But when he came to his intention of the house's evil reputation, the quality of his voice suddenly changed, and when he reached the end, it seemed as if he could contain himself no longer, and burst into that awful cackle that had made me shiver when I listened to him from a distance. With that cackle, all my feelings of friendliness and normality disappeared. I couldn't accept him on those terms any longer. I felt that I'd been weak to surrender myself to his story. To tell the honest truth, I felt that I hated him. My mind and body grew tense with apprehensiveness. In a state of that kind, reason has no chance against intellect. If I'd reasoned, I should have held my tongue. But literally, before I had time to think, I heard myself asking him what had made him recite Martock's October to Alma. "You knew I was in the next room, listening," I said, "and you knew that I was interested. You laid a trap for me. Why did you do that?" He rose and faced me, and as if he felt I had an advantage over him in standing. I was trembling from head to foot. The fire had died down so that I was still unable to see his face. For a moment he said nothing. Then, once again, he laughed. He didn't attempt to deny my suggestion. It seemed as if it pleased him. "Yes, curious, isn't it?" he said. Then, in that bitter, half-jocular tone, "It's time I went home and put my old woman to bed, Mrs. Wake, so I'll wish you good night. Au revoir, not goodbye. I look forward to seeing you both tomorrow afternoon." He pushed back a chair and walked straight past me, standing there stiff as a statue. "Alma," he called, "where the devil's the girl got to?" She ran into the passage to meet him. I heard them whispering together, and then the sound of another laugh and a cheerful good night. I knew that he'd gone, and I still couldn't move. Alma came into the room, as flushed and flustered as if she'd just been kissed. She spoke with a little breathless laugh. "What a long talk you and Mr. Furnival have had, ma'am. He'll go on for hours like that. He's a funny gentleman, isn't he? I don't understand a tenth part of what he says, but one has to sit and listen just the same, haven't they? I'm sure you're very kind to put up with him," she went on with a busy nervousness, scraping back into position the chair that he'd displaced. "I'm very grateful to you, I'm sure. He's such a hindrance. Gave me a chance of putting your room ready. I'm sure I don't know what he comes here for. As I sometimes say to Mother," and all this time she was longing for me to speak. I couldn't do it. I suppose she'd have listened to us if she'd dared, and as she hadn't dared, she was anxious to know what had passed between us. Not out of sheer curiosity, but out of jealousy. That was why she made such a point of treating me and herself as equal sufferers, disclaiming any enjoyment in Mr. Furnival's company. At last, with a sigh, she gave it up. "There's a lovely fire burnt up in the parlour," she said. "If I was you, ma'am, I think I'd go and sit by it. The gentleman can't be very much longer, surely." I had to force myself to speak. She was looking at me so hard and so slyly. "Yes, he ought to have finished by now," I said. I crossed the passage to the parlour. The fire, as Alma had said, was now flaring brightly behind the lamplight, and yet I couldn't stay there. I wanted most awfully to hear Ronald's voice, to put my arm in his. I wasn't frightened. I wasn't lonely, merely unhappy, detached, disorientated. It made me feel ashamed to admit it, but the feeling was so real that as soon as I'd sat down, I could stick it no longer, and just when Alma imagined that she'd got me settled for the evening, I jumped up in a hurry, threw on my cloak, and went out to find Ronald in the barn. The rain had stopped. It was a soft autumnal night, half lit by moonlight, that the mist spread over the whole countryside. It seemed to me so quiet and homely and natural that I felt more ashamed of myself than ever, and very nearly turned back. Halfway across the farmyard I saw Ronald coming to meet me, awfully pleased with himself, and whistling the forging song from Siegfried. He was so engrossed in it that he nearly ran into me. "Hello, Eve," he said. "What on earth are you doing here? You look like a ghost in that white cloak." I suppose I did. It was the thing I'm wearing now. "Do I?" I said. I felt quite happy again all of a sudden as he took my arm. I'd begun to think that you were never coming. "The tire was a beast," he said. "It hadn't been off before, so I had to wrestle with it like a dwarf in a cave. The glass is going up again. I can feel it in my wound. We shall have a fine day tomorrow and get off early." "Shall we?" I thought. I knew we shouldn't, but I didn't say a word. We walked out of the yard arm in arm, and stood for a moment on the green platform in front of the Fox, listening to the little owls that whimpered in the mist. That moonlight was just as different from this as it could be. You couldn't see a thing 10 yards away from you. Ronald had stopped his whistling and grown sentimental. "I wonder," he said, "how many times the Romans saw it like this, standing to take breath on the top of the hill. I suppose it was all thick forest then. Colonia Alborum. But they wouldn't be able to see the trees for the mist. I wonder if this site has ever been excavated. I'm pretty well up in those things, but I don't seem to remember having seen it mentioned. What fun it would be to settle down here at the Fox for a month and get permission to dig." "It has been excavated," I told him, "but nothing's been published." "Really?" He was quite excited. "Who told you that? The distracted Alma?" "No," I said. "Mr. Furnival. I've been talking to him. He invited us to go and see his treasures at Cold Harbour tomorrow afternoon." "What luck! But afternoon makes it difficult. That means cutting it a bit fine." "I know that. I told him." I couldn't keep it back any longer. "He's got all George Martock's manuscripts, too." "Well, I dare say we could manage it at a pinch," said Ronald. He knew how near anything of Martock's was to my heart. "What do you feel about it yourself? Would you like to risk it and stay?" I couldn't answer him. For the moment my mind was curiously divided. My first and most honest thought was an overwhelming no, but the chance of seeing and handling Martock's manuscripts, the only opportunity, as I told myself, that I should ever get, made me hesitate, and Ronald, who's used to quick decisions on my part, grew anxious at once. "If there's any doubt about it," he said, "we won't give it another thought. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that this place has been getting on your nerves. I felt that from the very first, so we'll push off early tomorrow morning for the good of our consciences. How's that?" But by this time the balance of my thoughts had tilted over. I told myself that it was just childish to be frightened of Mr. Furnival or his house. I wanted, more than I could possibly express, to stay, and invented all sorts of specious arguments for staying. "I'm not really nervous," I told him, "and, after all, it would be a pity to miss the chance of seeing things that appeal to both of us. I should never forgive myself if you didn't examine that pavement, and if we leave about 5, we can surely get home by bedtime. It's only a 4 hours' run." "Barring accidents," he agreed. "And the law of averages," I said, "is against us having another." He laughed. "You can't spoof me with your law of averages," he said. "What you really mean is that you want to stay, and I'm not at all sure that it's good for you. We'll discuss it over the fire when I've got some of this mud and grease off my hands. Sit down there and be comfortable." He hurried off upstairs and left me. When I told him that I wasn't nervous, it was the honest truth. Ronald is such a steady, reassuring person that you can't feel nervous in his company. I knew that when I went out to find him, and by this time my panic had quite subsided. While I sat there waiting for him, Alma came into the room again. It seemed as if she couldn't leave me alone until she'd satisfied herself exactly of what had passed between me and Mr. Furnival, and hoped to do so just by hanging around. It was rather embarrassing, for neither of us had anything we could say to the other, and yet she couldn't tear herself away. Then Ronald came downstairs, shut the door behind him, and brought her to the point with his brutal, surgical directness. "Don't go, Miss Higgins," he said. "I want you to tell us all about Mr. Furnival." "About Mr. Furnival, sir?" she repeated. She looked around at that closed door like an animal in a trap. "Yes, Mr. Furnival," said Ronald, with a sort of hearty brutality that he can do to perfection. "Come along now." "But I know nothing about him," she said. "Nothing at all." "Why, an hour ago," he told her, "you couldn't talk about anything else." "Well, that's just gossip, sir," she said. "What everyone knows." He wouldn't leave it at that. "But surely," he said, "you are such close neighbors, you must know more than anyone else. He's been kind enough," Ronald went on, "to invite us to see Cold Harbour tomorrow." Her eyes brightened. This was one of the things she'd been wanting to know. "Yes, sir?" she said. "Well, I should go if I were you. They say it's very interesting." "So you've told us before," said Ronald. "Haven't you been there yourself?" "Oh, yes, I've been there," she answered. "Once." "Well, then," said Ronald cheerfully, "you can tell us what it's like." She shook her head. It seemed as if she shivered. "I don't think I can, sir," she said. "It was a long time ago. I can't bring much of it to mind." "But you'd like to go there again, wouldn't you?" Ronald pressed her. "That I shouldn't." This time she evidently spoke the truth. "Now that's a funny thing to say," Ronald persisted. "I suppose you frightened yourself with those stories about it being haunted? You didn't see any ghosts, did you?" "Of course I didn't," she said with a feeble laugh. "I don't credit all that nonsense. Mr. Furnival says—" she went on quickly, then stopped and picked herself up again. "I'm sure Mr. Furnival will tell you what he thinks of it." "Why can't you tell us?" Ronald rallied her. "Because I know nothing about it," she said almost angrily. "I've told you that before." It was evident that the poor thing was now genuinely distressed by Ronald's questions. I felt it my positive duty to come to her rescue. "Dr. Wake is only joking," I said. "You mustn't take him too seriously." She gave me one look of sacred gratitude and retreated to the door. In another minute I think she would have burst out crying. "At what time would you like your breakfast, ma'am?" she said piteously. "Are we making an early start?" Ronald asked me significantly. "No," I said. "We shan't start till the evening, after tea. I think 9 o'clock will do for breakfast." "Bacon and eggs, ma'am?" Alma inquired tragically. "Yes, that will do," I said as kindly as I could. "You needn't bother to come in again. We'll put out the light." She went out. By this time we were both awfully sleepy. Ronald yawned and began to unlace his shoes. Suddenly he asked me why I had decided to stay. "I don't know," I said. "Partly curiosity about those manuscripts, partly pity for the poor girl. You did bully her, you know." Ronald laughed. "Not a bit of it. I wanted to know what she could tell us." "She didn't want to tell you anything," I said. "You could see that for yourself." "Obviously. As we said before, she's in love with him. That's what makes her secretive. As for bullying her, I'm just as sorry for her as you are. It's very awkward for a girl of that class to deal with a married man's attentions." And yet her life here with the old woman must be pretty deadly. I should imagine that Mr. Furnival must be the one spot of brightness in her existence. The word seemed incongruous. Brightness, I said. Well, of course, I'm quite in the dark, Ronald confessed. I've never set eyes on the gentleman. You have, so you'll be able to tell me how he struck you. And then, quite unawares, I found myself echoing Alma's words. I know nothing about him, I said. You too, Ronald laughed. And I think that's an excellent place to stop for the night. The chapters only get longer from here on out. An interesting book. Rather slow to get going. But isn't it weird that this... It did say Wales. Didn't it say it was set in Wales? I was thinking how we read Benighted. Was that last year, which was set in Wales? But it's also interesting that it has a character named Alma in it. And was it stream before last? I know it was a couple of streams ago, but I sang that song about the heights of Alma because it was the 20th of September. Funny how those things work. And hey, Captain Thaco, thanks for coming in. Well, I reckon I should... yes, late. Well, too late to even go out on a bender of any substantial length. But I'll see who's still online and who will raid, and then tell you chaps what's coming up on the stream. Remember to turn everything back on for next stream. We raided AWOL Trooper not long ago. Ghoul Babe is playing Night Trap, the classic FMV game. Is it actually fun, though? You know, we haven't read Haggard Hessian in a good bit, and he's online. Doesn't seem to be streaming as much, come to that. Yes, let's drop in and say hi to him. He's playing Zelda, the Four Swords. Is that one of the Game Boy ones? Damned if I can remember. Entirely too many Zelda games, if you ask me. Anyway, but as for stream, I don't know what I'm gonna play tomorrow because I don't know of any short horror cinematic platformers. And just how much can I stretch the definition of platformer? And then Sunday, you know, I actually post on the Nameless Inheritance webpage asking if there's a walkthrough or hints, because I don't know that I'll be able to figure out what to do just wandering around more, and I'm loath to do that. So if I don't hear it back, then it'll be a choice between going back to Resident Evil 3 and trying to cram one more cinematic platform into Cinematic Platformer September. There's at least one more modern one in my Steam library that seems like a 2-streamer. And then I can't stream Wednesday this week because I'm going to a special event with my boss, which will be fun. But I'll try and do a stream on Tuesday instead. Another reason I couldn't do a bonus audiobook stream this week. And yes, I know we're just about in Spooktober, and for that I'll be alternating Alone in the Dark, New Nightmare, and Resident Evil 3. Which both take me well into November, I imagine. Oh, blasted Heath Hessian just raided out. It doesn't Darth Elwood. I know him vaguely. Did he last raid? God, I can overthink everything. Nah, let's raid Atari Beer Pong. I feel like that's been a bit. Oh, unless one other person I should check is online. Ah. Oh, he's playing Splatterhouse 2. That's one of the great horror games. Is it the best in the series? Some might say so. What am I doing? Okay. Sorry, it's been a week, chat. There we go. Well, thank you guys for coming to hang out for a nice, chill audiobook stream as we slowly make our way into the horror of this novel. I appreciate all the chatters and all the lurkers. And we'll be back to gaming again tomorrow. And you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random stuff. And y'all can find VODs of my past streams up on YouTube. So I hope that everybody has a good night. Dreams of colonial Roman trees and ruins. Say hi to Atari Beer Pong. And I'll see you guys, well, probably tomorrow.